We are going to kick off. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vishwas Satka. I'm an academic at Wits University, but I'm actually wearing my hat as the board chairperson of the Cooperative and Policy Alternatives Center, COPAC. COPAC is also a vibrant alliance partner of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. Before I introduce our speaker, I'm just going to share my screen to just frame a little bit of the challenge that our guest is going to talk to. So as we all know, the idea of a universal basic income grant, and I must say the word grant is rather anachronistic and specific to South Africa because of the way the welfare system has developed here. But nonetheless, it's not the first time that this idea has come to the fore in our national discourse, is part of our national conversation. In the early 90s, particularly Professor Guy Standing was also part of a process and a moment where this idea was articulated, and he played a role in bringing it into our conversation around policy, our welfare system, and so on. In the 2000s, we had a very important commission on our welfare system, the Taylor Commission. And the Taylor Commission also put forward the proposition of a basic income grant. There was the Income Grant Coalition, and involving various progressive civil society organizations that also amplified the case and the argument. But of course, it didn't land, it didn't translate into policy for the country. We are now in a third moment when the idea of a basic income grant is coming to the fore. It's the moment of converging crises. Last year, the Climate Justice Charter process involving the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign also has argued for a basic income grant. Now, in the midst of COVID-19, the Food Sovereignty Campaign has been arguing for a basic income grant, but not alone. This has now become a broader platform under the banner of #YouBigNow, involving at least 126 organizations the last time we checked, and that number is growing. So we are now in this crisis, and the Minister of Social Development and the government initially responded by basically announcing a top-up of existing social grants. There's a COVID relief grant. It's set at a very miserly level of 350 rands. It's estimated that between 10 and 15 million people should be getting this grant. Right now, the uptake is very low, just over 4 million. There's been an institutional crisis because it's been means tested. There's a whole host of bottlenecks, and the crisis on the ground is worsening. The Minister of Social Development then subsequently announced that government was looking into a basic income grant and would be doing some work on this. And come October, when the COVID relief grant will expire, they want to announce something on this. Now, I want to just bring in this particular, well, 2 slides that were actually prepared by an official in the Social Development Department, Brenton von Breda. And I actually want to set this up also as a conversation with government, but also with society more broadly from this platform. So the other day, Brenton presented to a Business Day seminar, and he basically put up this slide, which breaks down the social grants we have in South Africa, from an old age grant to a child support grant. And you'd see that we have about 18 million people on the grant system in South Africa. It's a very variegated or diverse grant system that we have. It's costing us annually about 182 billion rands. Now, Brenton raised a very important issue, and he said, you know, we need to evolve this welfare system. What is the gap? The Constitution provides for everybody to have right to welfare in South Africa. And so he was making the argument that the gap that's there is the cohort between 18 and 59, and we should be putting in place a special grant for that category of people. He didn't really specify a number, but he was leaning towards the food poverty line, which was just over 500 rands. It kind of echoes a position of the ruling party, the ANC, as well. So that's kind of one idea, if you like, in the public debate right now. But we are in a moment of very, very deep crisis, a profound social reproduction crisis in South Africa. It's been there before COVID-19, and it's worsened during COVID-19. So we need a requisite response. We need a proportionate response. And we also need an imaginary, and we need a debate about various options to transition this welfare architecture that we have in South Africa. There are other possibilities if you look at this table in front of you. If overnight we set the grant level, a universal grant at above, say, the old age grant for everybody in South Africa, it'll fundamentally transform this welfare architecture. If you, for example, marry the child support grant, which goes to almost 13 million children, you keep it at the existing level, plus everybody over the age of 18 gets a substantive basic income grant, you can fundamentally transform this architecture. So this is a moment for us to incite the imagination, to assert our right to dream, but to also deepen the public debate around this progressive and transformative and systemic idea. Now, the big issue, and Von Breda also made this point, when you look at it technocratically, and largely the sort of governing neoliberals in any society will always ask, well, how much is this going to cost? Well, Van Breda was right in pointing to the sort of inequality divide and cleavage in South Africa. So if you look at the data from the World Inequality Database, which he also used in his presentation, well, inequality has been widening, income inequality, since '94. Initially, the top income earners, the top 10%, had 46% of the cake. In 2002, 55% of the cake. In 2010, 60%. And more recently, 65% of income goes to the top 10%. So we have progressively become an unequal society, whereas the bottom 90% get 35% of national income. So we agree with Van Breda that we really have to look at these inequalities sharply. But we'll go further to argue, as the You Big Now campaign, that we have to have radical redistribution. And all of us in this debate have to ask ourselves this question. Do we want a society that looks like this, that is skewed like this going forward? Or do we want to use this moment to say, well, listen, the rich shouldn't be having 65% of national income, okay? But they should have way, way, way less than this. Because the moment you enter this debate from this perspective, you are fundamentally addressing the question of resourcing. But there's one other thing around this issue that we are raising as the You Big Now campaign. It's a fundamental question. Is society too big to fail? And we are saying it's not too big to fail, okay? I mean, we're saying it is too big to fail. We are saying that businesses in the 2007-2009 crisis made this argument. They claimed their status in society, and they were given massive, massive support. We are saying at this historical moment, society is too big to fail. And therefore, we really have to start thinking about the universal basic income grant. The data that's coming out from our food relief mapping is showing deep hunger and starvation, and some are calling it a humanitarian crisis in South Africa right now. Unemployment has gone up, according to the CRAM study, during this lockdown. 3 million people, mainly women, are the shock absorbers. But to take this conversation further, we've been curating the kind of intellectual contributions and debate in South Africa. There's over 30 articles that have been written in South Africa by academics, by activists, etc., all calling for a universal basic income grant. Before I introduce our guest speaker to take us through the kind of principles, the design, maybe a bit of the history of this idea, we're just going to introduce some voices from below and launch a video clip. I'm going to hand over now to Jane Cherry quickly to do that for us.
The reality of the matter is while people have reported back to work, the economy continued to shed jobs. To this date, under this current lockdown, more than 3 million jobs have been lost in this country, and there are no prospects of full employment. The economy is not growing, it is stagnant. The hunger is rising. The inequality is on the rise. People live in the sea of poverty and unemployment.
There is no sustainability or even guaranteed income, a factor that places our members in a state of extreme vulnerability. This pandemic has indeed exacerbated our situation tenfold. We are literally at the mercy of our landlords, in particular local government. Inclement weather as well has the ability to decimate our incomes, particularly during these winter months. I am of the firm belief that a basic income grant is not just an essential, but a justly warranted requirement.
We need the basic income grant for people to live. We need the basic income grant for people to be able to survive. We need the basic income grant for people to be able to use it, to give people purchasing power, to create a demand so that our economy is able to grow. The dignity of our people have been vandalized. We need the basic income grant to restore the dignity of our people.
Hi, I'm Hamida from Naledi, and we'd hereby like to add our voice to the demand for a big in South Africa. We know that that government has actually come out to say they support the big. We don't want to just see support and commitment. We want to see immediate implementation of the big now.
Thank you, Jane. So, as we can see from that the crisis of social reproduction at a societal level is cutting across. It's hitting the employed and workers losing their jobs. It's hitting the informal traders. It's hitting the different sections of our society. So to help us situate this idea of a basic income grant, universal basic income, to ground it, we are fortunate to have with us Guy Standing. He's a professorial research associate at SOAS University London. He's an economist with a PhD from the University of Cambridge. He's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and the Royal Society of Arts, co-founder and president of the Basic Income Earth Network. He's been a member of the Progressive Economic Forum. In 2016-2019, he was an economic advisor to the Shadow Chancellor Exchequer, John McDonnell. He's been at various university programs and he's been research director for President Mandela's Labor Market Policy Commission and has written several books on basic income pilots. His books include The Precariat, The Dangerous Class, translated into 23 languages, The Corruption of Capitalism, Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen, Plunder of the Commons, A Manifesto for Sharing Public Wealth. He is a co-author of Basic Income, A Transformative Policy for India. He's also recently collaborated with Massive Attack in a musical video based on his most recent book, Battling 8 Giants, Basic Income Now, which has had over 200,000 views and so on. So over to you, Guy.
Well, thank you very much, Fish. And I thought your introduction was spot on. It situates the whole debate. It took me back to the fact that in 1995, I was working with Tito Mboweni, who was then Minister of Labour, and I was Director of Research for Mandela's Labour Market Commission. And I remember the two things about that. First, that Tito wrote the preface of the book, in which I recommended doing precisely the sort of things you're talking about now. I said that it was fundamentally important to start the restructuring by reducing inequality, which at that time had a Gini coefficient of over 0.6, one of the highest in the world. And everybody was thinking that you have to reduce inequality. Unfortunately, the day that I delivered my report to the cabinet with Thabo Mbeki in the chair, the same afternoon GEAR was presented, the IMF perspective. And I warned at the time that if GEAR was followed, there would be several decades of sluggish growth, continued mass unemployment, and worsening inequality. Now, it doesn't give me any pleasure to be saying that that's basically what has happened. And I remember that two things that happened. One was that I had the great pleasure of presenting my report to Nelson Mandela in his house. And he said to me, he said, winning the peace is going to be much harder than winning the war. And of course, that's precisely what has proved to be correct. And Thabo Mbeki, when he looked at my report, he commented, and I didn't fully understand it at the time, he said, this is a horse, not a camel. In other words, it runs. And right now, South Africa needs a horse, not a camel. And we've been through the process. I was advisor to Vivian Taylor's committee that you've mentioned. I was very disappointed when she left the country just before it was due to be published, so it didn't get taken very seriously, but it was a very coherent plan in which a lot of very distinguished South Africans had made big contributions. And later on, I had the pleasure of being an advisor to a subsequent Minister of Labour, who was also sympathetic towards big. So here we have a situation where there's been this rumbling of a debate with some fantastic movements. The church has been very prominent. Desmond Tutu gave a lovely speech at one conference we organized in Cape Town, and we've got potential momentum. Now, I've been arguing that this pandemic and the pandemic slump that we're experiencing was a crisis waiting to happen. This is the 6th pandemic this century, and we're going to see more pandemics, more great shocks to the system. And fundamentally, from an economist's point of view, it's a demand shock, a big demand shock. And I'll come back to that later. And the events are relevant because the real lesson that the world is having to learn is that the resilience of society, the resilience of you and me, will depend on the resilience of the weakest groups in our society. If some groups are left economically insecure and increasingly vulnerable, then all of us will remain increasingly vulnerable and unresilient. And therefore, what has the response that is required is one that has to give everybody resilience. That is a key argument for basic income. The question I would pose to the government and to its supporters at this moment is, can South Africa afford not to have a basic income or big? I believe it's essential. It's absolutely essential. And I would make a supplementary secondary recommendation, which is that if you're not prepared to go forward now on a basic income, at the very least, launch some pilots in certain areas to see how it's best implemented and what would be the effects and how best to put it into practice. Now, I think the schemes that have been summarized at the moment are a mishmash. Many means-tested schemes have high exclusion errors. Many people who should be eligible don't get them. The bureaucracy and the unfairnesses that are built into a complicated system are so well known. And it's not specific to South Africa, it's specific to every country that has gone down that road. Now let me come to the essence of the talk I want to give, which I'm going to give a definition, and then I'm going to give the ethical reasons why we should have a big in South Africa, or a big system, as I would prefer to call it. And then I will consider the economic arguments, and finally some of the results of pilots in which I've been involved around the world, in Africa, in Asia, North America, and in Europe. You're listening to a man who has a peculiar habit of having done pilots of an idea that in which he's believed for many years. Now, the definition is very simple. It is a basic amount paid to every individual, a modest amount to enable them to survive in extremis, in dignity. It's unconditional in behavioral terms, it's not means tested, and it is paid regardless of employment status, regardless of marital status, household status, and so on. It is non-withdrawable, it's an economic right. However, since 1995, the Constitution of South Africa is a rights-based constitution, and that's one of the most admirable features of the post-apartheid era South Africa, that it is a rights-based constitution. And a basic income is not a matter of charity, it's not a matter of dole, it's saying that it's an economic right of everybody. Now, the ethical case, which I've developed in my books on basic income, is the following. Very simply, but you can elaborate it in many ways. First of all, it's a matter of common justice. The income and the wealth of every one of us is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the many generations that went before us. And if we allow for the private inheritance of private wealth, which is a lot of something for nothing because they haven't done work to obtain it, then we could see a basic income as a sort of social dividend on public wealth created by the many generations before us. Because we don't know who had contributed more or less, but we do know that it is not done by us individually, but we should be treating ourselves as equal commoners. It's a matter of common justice. If you're religious, you should also recognize that God has given people unequal talents, and in a sense, a basic income would be compensating those who do not have the talents of making money or having the connections that make their wealth and so on. So a religious argument is perfectly acceptable. If you want to talk about ecological justice, you can say, well, most of the pollution is actually caused by the rich. They are the ones that fly around the world. They're the ones who have beautiful cars. They're the ones who are polluting in various other ways. But the people who pay the price of pollution are mainly the poor. So a basic income would be a compensatory mechanism for that ecological injustice. The second ethical reason is that a basic income, however modest, would enhance the freedom to say no to an oppressive landlord, oppressive spouse, or oppressive employer. And it would also give you positive freedom, the freedom to make decisions morally for yourself. It also strengthens Republican freedom, the freedom to be avoiding unaccountable power by people in a position of unaccountable power. And in this regard, I recall a situation in Namibia where we did a pilot a few years ago. And at the end of the pilot, I was visiting one of the villages. And I called some young women across and I said, what has been the best thing for you about having a basic income? The best thing. And they giggled and a bit shy, is understandable. And then one of them said, you know, when the men came down from the fields at the end of the month, we had to say yes. Now we've got our basic income, we can say no. That's freedom, that's emancipation. And I've seen similar experiences in India and elsewhere where it's existed. And the third ethical reason is that a basic income would give people basic security. Basic security is not the same thing as total security, but basic security is a human need. And it's a public good in the sense that you having basic security does not deprive me of having basic security. And in fact, if we all have basic security, the value of that basic security increases. And also, psychologists have shown that people who have basic security have a higher mental bandwidth. People who are chronically insecure lose mental capacities, their IQ declines, and it's unfair of us to expect people in those circumstances to be taking rational decisions that most of us would wish that they would take. So this ethical reason of basic security is fundamental to the justification of a basic income. Now, I think in that regard, the consensus that's emerging in many parts of the world is seeing these ethical reasons in a context of this pandemic, which shows that so much of the insecurity, the loss of freedom, the deprivation of justice is pretty random. And millions of people are suddenly realizing this system cannot continue. And that leads to the economic justification. First of all, a basic income system, and why I use the term system, is that everybody should have a basic income, but those who have special needs, extra costs of living, or lower probability of getting an income should have supplements. Therefore, there should be a consolidation, but with extra grants, extra benefits for those with special needs. And it's why I prefer to call it a basic income system. Now, one of the fundamental arguments for a basic income now in this pandemic slump is that we've had a huge demand shock. People can't afford to be spending, their incomes have gone down, the economic uncertainties they're experiencing have increased, and they're not spending on basic goods and services. A basic income paid equally to everybody, taxed back from the wealthy in some way, come to that, would twist the demand for basic goods and services, the localized supply of goods and services, precisely what an economy like South Africa requires at this crisis point. You don't want to be stimulating the demand by the bankers and by the toffs who are making huge salaries and have huge wealth. You want to be stimulating the demand for people who are going to have a high propensity to consume and therefore stimulate demand, which would stimulate supply. And in that regard, I think the Treasury position, which they've adopted since 1995 from the IMF rulebook, tragically, is sadly ridiculous. The idea that public spending in a pandemic has to be slashed because it is likely to be crowding out private spending and private investment is just bad economics. It's just chronically stupid economics. Rather than crowding out private spending, if you increase spending on a basic income or something like that, you stimulate demand, which would stimulate investment because there are going to be higher returns to investment. And there is not, it would actually crowd in private investment and private spending. It is wrong in a pandemic slump to be thinking of slashing public spending and putting an austerity agenda back into the cauldron, if you like, would be wrong. Now, I think that you could pay for a basic income in South Africa by building what I've called a commons fund. I won't go into the details, but basically building up a capital fund, a national capital fund that would be investing in sustainable, ecologically sustainable industries and firms, and with the returns building up the capacity to pay a higher basic income going forward. But in the immediate future, you have already a strong debate on the need for a wealth tax. Wealth has risen relative to income dramatically under what I've called global rentier capitalism. In many countries, wealth has risen to hundreds of % of national income, including my own, incidentally. It's a global thing. We need a wealth tax. We need a wealth tax that is graduated, sustainable. It doesn't have to be high, but at least it will help raise the sort of funds needed. The same with an inheritance tax. South Africa needs an inheritance tax. But most importantly, you've now introduced a carbon tax. But at the moment, the carbon tax is a gesture. It's a gimmick. With all the emission allowances, most people doing the carbon spending, if you like, are not having to pay much. When the Treasury said that it will not raise electricity prices, and one said, well, it should, because if it's not doing that, what's it doing? It's not really working. So you need a much bigger carbon tax. As around the world we've found, a carbon tax by itself is regressive. It tends to increase inequality. It will only become progressive and politically popular if you guarantee that the revenue raised from carbon tax is recycled to the citizens through carbon dividends, basic income, part of the payment for a basic income. Now, I think that the costing is something that you can solve by one way or the other. It's a political choice. I assure you that it is affordable. And now I'd like to just mention some of the results that we've seen from pilots. I've summarized them in the basic income books, but I think it's important because it should say to Treasury, it should say to Minister Zulu, it give you strength to continue the fight for a basic income, because the effects show decisively that the net cost of a basic income grant system would be much less than the gross costs. People who do a back of envelope calculation, they say the population is this, and if you gave people this, and therefore it would cost X%, neglect altogether the multiplier effects, the fact that if people are spending, they're generating other income, they're generating employment, they're generating taxable income. That's a multiplier effect, which means that the net cost is going to be less than the gross cost. But there are other things that are incredibly important. In every pilot in which I've been involved, in Africa, in India, and in Canada, and in Finland, one of the most incredible results, consistent, regardless of the different methodologies, the different designs, the different types of population, is that it results in improvements in health, particularly mental health. And in some of the pilots, what we've seen is that it results in people having fewer illnesses and being able to deal with the illnesses that they do get, being able to take their medicines from the beginning to the end of a course. Poor people tend to just take a bit and then stop. But in fact, well, if you have a basic income guaranteed, then people tend to take their medicines through to completion. And of course, it's reducing stress and all the cardiac cancer problems down the road associated with stress. Stress I called one of the 8 giants confronting us today. And besides health, and incidentally on that regard, a pilot in Canada found that as a result of basic income payments, 1 year later, the number of hospital visits had fallen by 8%. So it has a big effect. The second thing is that it results in improvements in schooling. We've seen with the social pension in South Africa, that's been one of the great effects over the few generations. But this is a general finding with all basic income schemes. It results in improved attendance at school and improved performance by children attending school. One longitudinal survey in North Carolina found that after 16 years, the children that had been receiving the basic income were 1 year ahead in school on average, with control variables and so on, than the children who had not been receiving the basic income. A further finding from the pilots and from experiments, contrary to prejudice on the veranda, that if you gave people a basic income, they would all become lazy, they would not do any work, they would, not do anything. People with basic income work more, not less. They tend to do more productive work. They tend to devote more time to caring for their loved ones, for their community, and they tend to be more cooperative in their work. And in general, this creates an atmosphere conducive to a more productive economy. And that, I think, is a very important finding. Another finding that we found in pilots is that it results in reduction of debt. We all know that South Africa is suffering from the highest private indebtedness in the world, one of the very highest. Somebody will think of some other country, but when you have 85% of people borrowing in the course of a year, and that was last year, you know that debt is built into the system. We know that. But what people, when they even have a modest basic income, they start paying down their debt. They have an ability to withstand pressure to take out new high interest debt. And at the same time, they put some money aside to save. So that when they have a shock or a hazard, you see pooling in a community, within a family, to help get through the process. It's a pretty obvious sort of phenomenon, but it's a very healthy one. And it's only facilitated by people having this basic income security. Now, I think the last point that I want to make is that the finding that's really staggered me in doing pilots is when I've been out in the field, as we call it, I came to the conclusion that the effects were much better than the sums of money that we seem to be giving in basic incomes. And it dawned on me one day when I was in an Indian village. And the reasoning is this: the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than its monetary value. It gives people a sense of control. And if you think that poverty ultimately is about a lack of money, it's about a lack of resources to acquire the essentials of life. And money is a commodity. And any commodity that is scarce, the price rises. And in rising, it makes it harder and harder for people to survive. If you increase the supply of money through basic income grants to low-income communities, you cheapen the price of money. And that, of course, is just what those on the edge of chronic debt need and want. So I think the essence of the economic arguments is pretty strong. I want to conclude by recalling that in 1942, William Beveridge wrote a report for the British government. He was a pretty dull sort of character, very Edwardian and not very exciting. And he, uncharacteristically, he wrote on page 2 of his report, "This is a time for revolutions, not patching. We have to slay 5 giants." And the giants for him were disease, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and want. And in my new book, I took that theme and I said, today we are confronted with 8 modern giants that are blocking our road to a good society, whether it's South Africa, Britain, United States, or any other country. And the 8 giants are hugely more powerful and threatening than they were in 1942. The first giant is inequality, and it's inequality of wealth more than inequality of income. It's inequality of inherited, and it's inequality of unearned wealth. There's insecurity. Insecurity is a chronic pandemic in itself. Millions of people are in the precariat. Millions of people are suffering from uncertainty, and we need a strategy to give a floor to uncertainty so people can be able to cope with uncertainty. We have a pandemic of stress. Stress today is a terrifying threat, raising levels of morbidity, early deaths, suicides, and all the things that we know about. We also face this chronic debt problem. Debt is a giant. Rentier capitalism, the financial institutions want us to be in debt. And we need a strategy to get debt put back in its box. The same with the fifth giant, which is precarity, the sense that we're losing rights, we're losing economic rights, social rights. People are losing rights, and we need to reverse the trend. Then we have the robots and automation, which is causing a lot of disruption. I don't believe it's making us all redundant, but it's increasing the inequalities. It's the 7th giant that is the most threatening of all, and the one that we really need a strategy to defeat. The basic income cannot defeat the threat of extinction, but it can help us fight that threat. Basic income would enable us to have a greater sense of control of time, greater sense of being able to spend more time caring for our loved ones, caring for the community, reproducing society and our assets. It would enable us to say growth of GDP is not the ultimate objective of life or society. Yes, we can have increased number of goods and things, but we need to have control, whether you use the term degrowth or whatever. You need to be fighting extinction on several fronts, and a basic income can help in that regard. And finally, the 8th giant is the threat of neo-fascist populism. I hope that we're not going to see the drift in South Africa to that. We've seen it in the United States. In my book on the precariat, I warned that there would be a political monster. And 5 years later, there was one in the White House. And we are in danger of seeing an authoritarian populism spreading because people are insecure, people are fearful, people are traumatized. And we need a vision, as Vish said, an imaginary of a good society, and a society in which everybody has equal basic security, is a society that I would like my children and grandchildren and all of yours to be living in as a matter of course. Now is an opportunity for Tito to go back to the sort of man I knew in the 1990s who wrote the preface to my report and who has this transformative ideas in his mind to consolidate and help the minister, who's been making very good sounds and sounds to me as if she understands what is needed. And I think the only way we will get a big system in South Africa is if we, all the groups represented today, continue to build that pressure. Because we must always remember most politicians have spaghetti backbones, and they will only take the right course if we put the pressure on them to have stronger backbones. On that note, I'd like to conclude and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Guy, for the very coherent and compelling case. And with the brilliant insights into the pilots that you were involved with and so on. There's been a stream of comments and questions in the chat line. I'm going to try and bring those in maybe systematically one at a time, and you can respond to those. We've got till about 4:30. And then if we exhaust that, we could also move towards maybe bringing people in directly with voice to ask questions. So the one issue that has come up is the distinction between the dole system and the basic income grant. I don't know if you want to clarify that for us.
Dole is something given for being unemployed. Dole is conditional on someone being unemployed. And it's but a fundamental contradiction, because if you're unemployed and receiving the dole, you have a disincentive from taking a low-wage job or a casual job, because you would lose the dole. A basic income grant is given to you because you are Vish or somebody else. It's because you are you, not because you're in a particular labor status. It's the same with means testing. Means testing, which is usually associated with the dole, means that you only get it if you can prove to somebody that you are poor, and that you are poor not through your own fault. Okay, so you've got a double test that you've got to pass. That is crazy because it creates a poverty trap. In other words, if you try to raise your income above the poverty line, you'll lose the benefits, and you're effectively paying a marginal tax rate, which in many countries with means testing is 80% or more, right? So the highest income tax rate in South Africa is 45%. But in this case, if you had a means tested dole, you're effectively forcing those people to face a marginal tax rate of 80% or more. It's crazy. Big disincentive for taking the sort of informal, low-wage, casual jobs, which many people in the precariat can only hope to get. So it seems to me it is illogical. It results in enormous percentages of people not receiving the benefits, very high what we call exclusion errors, and some inclusion errors it gives to people who shouldn't be receiving it according to those rules, but very high exclusion errors. And it reminds me of a statement made by a famous sociologist in 1950, Richard Titmuss. He said that benefits that are only for the poor are invariably poor benefits. And I think that's a very good statement all these years later.
Yeah, it's the deserving poor issue around means testing. So there was a comment made about, and I think it relates to, how do you guarantee the basic income grant? Should it be locked in through a constitutional amendment, or is legislation adequate and sufficient? What are your thoughts on this, Guy?
It's a very good question. I've discussed it at length in one of the books, and I think ultimately it's important to find a way of de-politicizing the basic income grant system. Otherwise, you could easily have a populist government just before an election raising the amount, and just after an election lowering the amount. I think you need to have it constitutionally guaranteed, but I think that there should be an independent, democratically elected commission in charge, just as you have an independent monetary commission in many countries that look after monetary policies. I think that dealing with the basic income, and they should have rules on changing the level in case there's inflation or in case income goes up or income goes down. So affordability issues, that commission should have responsibility for managing the system, maintaining its integrity, and so on. I think that's an important issue.
Thank you for that. There's a question here. It's kind of long-winded, but I'm just going to get to the crux of it. It's about, what are the reasons for the IMF, World Bank, and others opposing the basic income grant? I'm not sure they do, but let's hear you out on this. They have their version of it, of course.
Yeah, I don't think the IMF is an institution oriented to social policy. It was meant to be a matter of stabilization. The World Bank was a matter of developing world capitalism. And the IMF does not have expertise on social policy. And therefore, I always find it irksome to be having to have debates with people from the IMF when they don't really know much about the subject. But I had a very interesting opportunity for discussing with Christine Lagarde when she was head of the IMF. And I made a presentation on basic income. She told me, I don't think I'm breaking any confidence, because she said it in public, that she herself had come round to supporting a basic income. I think their fiscal orthodoxy, the one I mentioned in my speech, where they somehow think that public spending crowds out private spending, I think is fundamental part of the neoliberal orthodoxy of the 1980s and 1990s, when the IMF and the World Bank and the other development banks were all geared to structural adjustment, supply side economics orthodoxy. And I think that they've got very stuck in the rut of that orthodoxy. And different people in the IMF say different things, so they're not very coherent in many respects. But now the World Bank has got a whole economics department, which has come round. They asked me to write the endorsement of the big report they've put out supporting basic income. So even sinners can repent, and more power to them. I mean, I know that some of your most wealthy plutocrats in South Africa have come out in favor, and they understand, to give them credit, they understand that they would have to be making some payment for building such a system. And we've seen the same in Silicon Valley. Some of the richest people in the world have recently come out saying, we need to be taxed more. We need a basic income because, in their view, automation is going to be wiping out jobs, etc. I don't believe that particular theme, but I do believe that we're in a very interesting moment when a Minister of Finance can genuinely look to increase certain types of taxes, whereas 20 years ago, it was much harder to do that without macroeconomic, exchange rate crises, flight of capital problems, etc. But in this pandemic slump, where we've got the rentiers of the world realizing that the economy is rigged in their favor too much, this was the subject of my book, Corruption of Capitalism, I think concessions are there. And if we don't take advantage of that, then it's a failure of our generation to redress the inequalities that have been mounting and are killing people, literally.
Thanks, Guy. So there's a question here about, why not jobs rather than a grant? I suppose this speaks to the challenge of full employment. Is it over? Is it still here? Your thoughts on this?
I have a personal distaste, which will probably alienate half my audience this afternoon. I hate the jobs fetish. I think that the jobs historically have not been very good things. We have to do jobs. We have to do labor. We have to do it. Let's not romanticize and put on a pedestal that having a job, pouring tea for a boss, or standing around doing something, or doing down in a mine dangerous labor is something that we want to maximize so that everybody's doing that for as much time as possible. It's just an absurdity. I agree with my friend David Graeber's statement that many jobs are bullshit jobs that actually don't contribute to well-being or health or economic output. That said, I'm really in favor of encouraging more work. And I think that one of the scandals of our statistics in every country is that the work that is done by more people than any other is treated as non-work. And that is care work, unpaid care work done by women, okay? And there have been valuations of the imputed value of unpaid care work. And in Britain, it came that when the Office of National Statistics valued care work, they found that it was worth more than all jobs in manufacturing and non-financial services put together. We need a reconceptualization of what we mean by work. A lot of people work incredibly hard and they don't appear in the statistics. They don't have any benefits. They don't have any status, and their work is taken for granted. I think that we need to overhaul what we mean by work and the statistics, because if we did that, we would see a lot of people have to do a lot of work for which they get paid nothing and has no value. But because of the bureaucracies, they have to do it. Because of the systems, they have to do it. And ideally, we should have a strategy for reducing much of that sort of work. That should be what a good society does, enabling us to do more of the work that would help improve our lifestyles, help improve relationships, help improve the sanitation of our communities, help to reproduce nature around us. This is all work, but I don't think focus uniquely on jobs. Most jobs are resource depleting, polluting. We don't need that sort of job, but we do need to respect the traditions of work. I believe in work. I work stupidly hard, but it shouldn't be equated with any type of job. And I think that's very important in South Africa, given its historically ridiculously high level of unemployment. People have to survive and they have to be given ways of living with dignity and being able to work on their enthusiasms and caring for themselves, their neighbors, their family. And that, I think, is why a basic income is so relevant at this pandemic moment.
So there's a question about, is the purpose of a wealth tax to raise revenue or to reduce inequality, bearing in mind the real difficulties of estimating rich people's wealth? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's both. I mean, well, as I mentioned, wealth inequality has risen vastly, and wealth has risen vastly compared with income. To give my own country's example, in the 1980s, the value of private wealth was about 300% of GDP, national income. Today, it's over 700%. So there's been a huge shift. And the reason is it's rentier capitalism. More and more of the income is going to those who have properties, financial property, physical property, or intellectual property. And we need to have levies on wealth, various sorts, including land value tax and so on. We need to shift our tax system away from earned incomes to wealth. And I've proposed a commons fund where you actually have levies on different forms of wealth that come from taking the commons from all of us, because the commons belong to all of us. And I think that you can do that because, as even neoclassical economists understand, it's easier to tax things that are non-movable than it is to tax something like income, which can be declared all over the place. And I think there are very easy ways of working out a wealth tax. It's been a good discussion in South Africa, I know, and in other countries too. And a carbon tax can be much more effective than it is at the moment.
Yeah, I think in some ways you've spoken to the next comment, which is about, you know, the land value tax is the best kind of wealth tax. But there's another idea here around financial transactions tax. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of a transaction tax. I don't think it would be the magic bullet that some people, Tobin initially thought that it might be. I mean, I think that it's a way of slowing down the financial transactions taking place. I think there are better ways of raising income. While I'm responding to that, my mind had already turned to a question I read on the chat thing. And I want to respond to that, if I may, which is that somebody has suggested, why not having a wage-led growth? This is something we discussed in our report in 1995. And the trouble with that is that we're in a globalized system. Whether we like it or not, we're in a globalized system. So whether you're in a South African situation or a British situation or a French situation, the downward pressure on real wages is overwhelming, because gradually in India and other countries, wages have been a 1/50th of what they were in Europe. Now they're coming up, they may be 1/30th. And if you try to raise wages in South Africa, you're really going to give problems for generating productive investment. It's a painful reality. Wages in the OECD countries have been stagnant in real terms for the past 35 years. I mean, they haven't been rising, even where the unions are strong or weak, or have a left of center government or a right of center government. It's been the situation all over the OECD. 35 years, stagnant real wages, and if you're in the precariat, falling real wages. It's not something one should welcome, but I think it means it's a reality check that we cannot expect to push up wages much. I'm all in favor of trying to do so, but I don't think we're going to get a lot of return going down that direction. And it may very easily increase unemployment and cause other social inequalities within the labor market. So I think, yes, I would say to Cosatu and others, keep pushing for wages. Yes, we'll support, we should all support. But I think going for a basic income will strengthen the bargaining position of people so that they can bargain for what they believe is a proper wage when they're dealing with an employer. They can tell when they're being screwed. But if they're individually insecure, their bargaining position is weak. If we strengthen their bargaining position because they have a basic income, then they can bargain more like equals. And that I think is important.
Thanks. There's a question here, which is really, I think, about, you know, sort of an incrementalist approach versus a more transformative systemic approach. I'll read it quickly. In South African policy circles, even those sympathetic to a big, raise concerns about the wealth tax cannot be implemented. Wealth is precarious. It will be eroded if distributed. Proponents of the big have argued that a wealth tax cannot be introduced in isolation. You need capital control, so the parameters need to change. So is it possible to introduce big with incremental changes, or do we need a fundamental systemic shift? And how probable is the latter? I mean, given this crisis. I mean.
Yeah, I think we should take each step at its time. I think we're in a unique moment. And that, of course, is an opportunity as well as a threat. It's a unique moment where if they were to introduce a consolidation with a big plus extra grants for people with special needs in the population, I think that would be seen as both a modest step, as giving resilience in this crisis, but would also open up the vista for a more transformative vision of a rainbow nation based on equality of status. And that, I think, is a wonderful transformative vision. It would be consistent with Madiba's own vision at the beginning of the independence era, in the sense that we know from experiments that basic incomes reduce inequalities between racial groups, between ethnic groups, between groups who have disabilities and don't have disabilities. And in that sense, it is a way, an instrument of forging a solidaristic society. That's one of the reasons why moving in this direction might appear individualistic, but in fact, it is increasing solidarity because everybody would feel part of it. I remember in that regard, when we were doing the pilot in Namibia, right at the beginning, a man, a big farmer, came down to where we were distributing first basic income payments. And he rode down in his 4x4, stopped, got out, came striding across to me, and he said, "What? Excuse me, but why are you giving me a basic income? I don't need a basic income. Why are you giving me?" So we said, "Well, look, this is your right. You're a member of the community. You're a member of this community. If you do not wish to spend it, you could give it to some cause that you believe, but this is your right." Later, a few months later, he became the most enthusiastic advocate of the basic income. He went to Windhoek and he was lobbying politicians and saying, "This has strengthened our community. I have seen it. This is really strengthening our community." Economic crime had gone down. The sense of solidarity had increased. They'd set up committees to help people spend the money in the way they felt was good for them. And this bloke, I mean, you know, I'm sure he gave his money away. It didn't matter to him. It was a very small amount for him. But that sort of solidarity comes, I think. We saw the same in India and the same in other countries. And strengthening solidarity at this point is going to be so important.
Yeah. So there was a sort of technical question around the parameters of the pilots, percentage size of the pilot studies you've been involved with, the length of time, and so on. Do you want to just comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in 5, 6 pilots, and they varied in size. The biggest one was in Indian villages, 6,000 individuals in 9 areas, and we had a control group of a bit more than that. And it was done over 2 years. And others have been longer, some have been shorter. And a complaint is that, well, what short term, you can't tell the long term is going to be different. True enough, except that we know from a pilot in North Carolina that I mentioned earlier, which went on for 16 years, that the longer term behavioral effects were even stronger than the short term effects. And what we did in our Indian case is we did what we called a legacy survey. We went back 3 years after we had ended the pilot and asked people questions about what had happened since the end of the pilot. And in a few cases, there had been recidivism, there had been falling back, you know, because people didn't have so much money, etc. But in most respects, particularly with regard to the attitudes to women and positions of women, the effects had continued. There had been a breakout of traditional constraints and so on. And the improvements in seed practices and farming and things like that all had continued. And I think that says a lot for the value of even short-term pilots. I would say to the authorities in Cape Town, Joburg, and so on, if you don't wish to go forward now with a basic income, which I very much hope you will have the courage to do, at the very least, try to mobilize funds from civil society, some of those plutocrats who've got billions of dollars, let alone rands, billions, to do some pilots to just see how wonderful the effects can be. And I would urge them to do both, because I think this is being on a road to a new system where a much better society will come out. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the most important thing of all at the moment is resilience. We need resilience.
So Guy, there's a question about the trade-off. Is there a trade-off between having public goods in the welfare state and the big? Is it either or?
I think that question, usually it's asked by a right-winger or a social democrat, and usually the easy answer is to say, no, there isn't a trade-off. We need both good public services and a basic income. That's the obvious answer, and it's the real answer. It's not an easy thing. We need both. What we need less of is polluting industries. We need less of vast wealth along the lines you displayed in those graphs at the beginning versus vast poverty and insecurity. That's what we don't need. And we can certainly improve the public services, because we need better health services, we need better care services, we need better education systems. Of course we do. But don't put it as either services or income security. We must have both, because a good society cannot have one without the other.
So this builds on the next question, actually, which is the transition in our sort of welfare architecture and system, because we have the existing grants. So how should we approach this? I mean, do we kind of build on what we have? Do we add on? Do we kind of sort of move the whole system in a systemic leap? I mean, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, this was a question that preoccupied Vivian Taylor's committee, if you remember. And the idea was that you gradually closed the gap so that you increase the child grant going up to a higher age group, and the social pension you made it for a younger age, and gradually close the gap. So anybody aged sort of 35 to 40 would have to wait until they got their basic income. But that was a strategy. I'm not particularly enamored by that particular thing, but it's a route. I think if I were sitting by Tito Mbweni now and he was saying to me, Guy, okay, I'm open to supporting the minister in moving in this direction, how best should we do? I think I would say, okay, to start with, you've got to give everybody a modest base, retaining the existing grants. Okay, so this temporary thing has to be made more sensible, less means tested. It should go to everybody. And then you're going to have to face the hard one, which is that gradually you would have to consolidate the system and be giving supplements for children, supplements for people with disabilities, supplements for certain other necessities, frail old age, of course. But the basic income would be the core that everybody receives. Now, it should not be beyond the policy designers in the Ministry of Social Development and the Treasury and elsewhere to be able to work out how to do that. But the important thing today, and for the next 6 months at least, is to make sure that every South African is getting enough to give them this resilience. Do not go for more means testing. Phase out means testing. Means testing is regressive. We know that from thousands of studies around the world. They don't reach, they're expensive to administer, they're inequitable. The people who really need it tend to be the ones who don't get it. And we know this from countless policies around the world. Move away from means testing, move away from conditionality, consolidate to give everybody this base. And then over time, you gradually phase out most of what is paid out in other grants, but have supplements that would continue to reflect that certain groups do have extra costs of living and certain groups have lower probability of earning an income than others. So they should have more in a basic income system than those who are more fortunate. But the essence must be you have a base. And that I think is the fundamental. Put it up on the wall. It's the base that matters.
So Guy, you've written about corruption and so on, and you know we've been traumatized by a looting machine here in South Africa, and there's a lot of concern in South African society about the state and corruption and so on. So there's a question here about, you know, how do we, you know, any redistributive mechanism also can be captured. So are there any thoughts around this, and how do we maybe insulate this, make it efficacious, and so on? Yeah.
I remember having this debate again in the 90s. Before I came to work in South Africa, I'd been working in Soviet Union, or what ex-Soviet Union. I'm director of ILO operations. And the IMF at that time were pushing for a squeeze on the state. They wanted to squeeze spending on the state and rapid privatization to get the market economy going. And I wrote and warned at the time that if you squeeze the state, the regulatory administrative state, you will automatically breed corruption and a kleptocracy will take over. And that is what happened in the ex-Soviet Union. And to a lesser extent, I'm afraid it was predictable in South Africa by the 1990s. Certain people were able to get into positions where it was just a lifetime bonanza, justified by some of them as returns for the losses that they'd had in the past, as if it was all about them. And there was a real loss of state integrity. We know that, it's no secret, everybody knows that. I think that with a basic income system, it would be absolutely essential to create the sort of commission that I mentioned earlier, that's independent of government departments and that is properly audited and has got a proper function and is transparent. I think that is fundamental. I think that this is a pandemic crisis that will force a lot of the younger people who are going into politics to have a greater sense of integrity, because we're all in it. And if they just look after themselves and feather their nests, then we're going to see a complete breakdown, and that would be so tragic.
Thanks, Guy. So there's some interesting sort of traffic around this idea of renaming the grant. So John Kruger is asking, you know, maybe we call it a citizen's dividend or a share. Any thoughts on this?
I like the question. When I wrote a book with Mike Sampson in 2001, I had an allegorical paper in there, and I said that in South Africa, they'd introduced freedom grants. And it was a sense that this was a grant that was linked to South Africa becoming free. And I could well imagine it playing well now, ditto with something like a solidarity grant. In my own book on plunder of the commons, I've said common grants, because it's a grant on the public wealth that's created by everybody over the generations. And in a sense, it's a return from the commons. And that has the advantage, maybe the questioner had this in mind, it moves the imagination away from thinking that this is income for doing nothing, which is a problem we've had in dealing with that argument. If you think of it as a return to public wealth, a share, a dividend, a common dividend, then I think it's more easy for many people who don't know about the subject to say, yeah, I can understand that. That sounds fair. That sounds just. And they don't fall into the trap of talking about something for nothing. A lot of the rich get a lot of something for nothing, but that they don't mention that when they're condemning the idea of a poor person having something.
Yeah. I'm gonna just pose two more questions lifted from the chat. I mean, the one is about undocumented migrants or immigrants. Should they be included? How do you deal with them? Our position currently is that all documented migrants and refugees must be included. It'd be nice to hear your view on that. And then the other is just about this issue of multipliers and the economic argument. Is it really about trumping that, maybe with the argument of the right to dignity and equality? So in other words, are the ethical arguments the primary arguments over the economic arguments? Yeah.
Well, let me deal with those two questions in the order. First, it is a problem that which migrants should be included. I think in an ideal world, we would say there should be no such thing as documented versus undocumented migrant. I'm a migrant. Don't know about you, but I'm a migrant. I hope for the moment that I'm documented, but I don't like the distinctions. But nevertheless, from a purely pragmatic purpose, because it's got to be politically acceptable, it's got to be politically legitimizable, I think that you're going to have some pragmatic rule that you give it to all usual residents in the country, and to legally recognize migrants once they've been in the country for a year or 2 years or what, some such pragmatic rule. That doesn't mean you give no help to new migrants or no help to undocumented migrants. They should be helped just like refugees should be helped by other policies. It's not a rationale for saying, ignore these other people. Wrong. It's saying that this particular policy is a matter of the citizens who are the usual residents in the country. And that's important because not only do you exclude new migrants and undocumented, but you also exclude non-resident citizens. So I live outside Britain, so I would not receive the basic income in Britain because I don't live in Britain. It would have to be paid to the usual residents of the country, with migrants having to wait for a certain amount of time. Otherwise you get welfare tourism and all the nonsense that people talk about. But I think you can deal with that. On the multiplier things, for me personally, the ethical case is why I support basic income. The ethical case. It's a matter of justice, it's a matter of freedom, it's a matter of security for everybody. But the economic case is very strong. I summarize the evidence from around the world, including conditional cash transfer schemes and other cash transfer mechanisms. It turns out that the multiplier effect of a basic income is much higher than any other form of social spending. The reason, of course, is that it gives most of the money to people who have least money. And they get a higher percentage amount, even though it's equal for everybody, but it's a higher percentage amount for a poor person than for a higher income person, obviously. And they spend most of that money. And it's because they spend on local goods and services, local food, local services, local furniture, whatever it might be, they spend it locally. That generates demand and investment for producing those goods. One of the phenomenal experiences we found in India was that after 1 year, and after 2 years even more, what had happened was that the output of the farms and local crafts had all increased enormously. And contrary to people who said that it would be inflationary, it had actually led to a lowering of unit prices because productivity had gone up and that they were producing more and making more incomes. And the economy was really booming, even though the modest amounts being paid. And it was the same in Namibia. But in Namibia, one of the beauties was it resulted in a fall of economic crime. People were not going and stealing their neighbors' vegetables and animals and so on. And as a result, the farmers had a bigger incentive to plant more and to grow more animals because they didn't think they were going to lose them. And therefore they were going to make more profit. So there are various mechanisms which doesn't require a PhD in economics to understand, but you can see how the multiplier effect works.
So Guy, history has come full circle, and we've got you back in this moment of crisis to enrich our debate, to enrich our thinking. Thank you so much for making the time and for coming through. Also, a very big thank you to the wider audience and participants. There were great questions, great engagements from all of you. We did invite the President, the Minister of Social Development, Tito, Minister of Finance. Obviously, I didn't see them in the chat line, but we definitely
I'd like to see Tito again.
We're definitely going to be sending them the link to this webinar. And hopefully they and their advisors and technical people will engage with this. In terms of, I also want to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which has supported us on this. But also to just say on the way forward for the sort of You Big Now campaigning, our next big step, of course, is to work with others in this alliance to get a petition out. And there's some creative ideas coming through on this. And we hope many of you will support this and propagate the petition. October, remember, is a key moment coming up when government says it's dropping the COVID relief grants, etc. The other issue is more endorsements. If your organizations want to endorse, please let us know. We'll add you to the list. We need to grow that list. Government needs to see the power of progressive civil society right now. We're also engaging on some technical work to look at the financing, look at the costing, look at wider social and ecological impacts of the UBIG for South Africa. So that's coming down the line, and we'll have further debates and engagements around those issues. So once again, a very big thank you to everybody who's participated, and yeah, forward to the UBI now. Take care, everybody. And take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Sorry we couldn't answer all the questions.